and we're ready to get into almost everything you wanted to know about the great mystery, but were afraid to ask or didn't know to ask. Part 10. Is there that many parts? My goodness. Well, welcome back. We're halfway through the Olivet Discourse, and we were matching it with the 7 seals in the book of Revelation. And we were covering the subject in this series because 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, where it says, "Seen of angels," is referring to the fact that the gathering together is part of the mystery. Most Christians don't know this fact, and that greatly affects eschatology or end times doctrines. Another reason I'm covering this is to defeat fear. We're living in the grace administration, and we have a bunch of epistles that are written to us, and we Christians still have not mastered them. Why can I say that? Because all us Christians have not renewed our minds to who we are in the body of Christ. Otherwise, churches wouldn't be fighting each other. We'd be working together better and fighting our common foe, Satan. But there are some who, instead of trying to master what is written to us and required of us, have decided to major on the book of Revelation, which is still future. That material is awesome, and by its very nature, it's compelling, so I understand why some may be attracted to it, but they better be accurate with it, because it is so powerful that if incorrect, they can do a lot of damage with that wrong information. And the main thing that many of them don't know or properly acknowledge is that the great mystery is involved. See, many of them who don't know that are teaching that we are living in the book of Revelation period now, or that we Christians will have to go through the tribulation. And they say, don't be deceived, they warn. If Christians are not prepared when the tribulation starts, they might be deceived and not make it to heaven. Well, I know that they mean well, but they are mistaken. Some of them are even fearmongers taking advantage of and living off of people's fears. And when it comes to fear motivation, the difference between fear motivation and love motivation is living under the cloud instead of living on top of it. Well, I have proof that I'm going to heaven. I can speak in tongues. So I've decided to apply my method of studying the Word to the book of Revelation and figure it out enough to counter that error and quell those fears. But I don't expect to figure it all out and come up with a precise timetable, and that's because my assignment is on this era, and also because believers won't know all there is to know about the next age until it happens. And then we believers, we Christian believers, are going to be out of here. We're going to be in the gathering together on a separate timeline than the book of Revelation. And those who are left behind will be sent prophets who will tell them the criteria for salvation, etc., in the 6th administration. But I can tell you for sure that that information will be Jewish-centric. Why? The 144,000 will all be Jews. So any Gentiles who believe in the 6th administration during that time, they are going to need to deal with the Jews. Now, even though we're only partway done with this subject, we've already established some important issues. We already know that the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and Mark 13 and Luke 21 is Jesus' summary of the 6th administration. In fact, it is the best sequence that I have found. So, how do we know that for sure? Well, we've been able to establish the following pivotal truths. The first one is that we know exactly who 12 of the 24 elders are who are on the thrones in Revelation 5. They're the 12 apostles, minus Judas plus Matthias. And we also know from what group the other 12 saints come from who will occupy the other thrones. They have got to be exemplary 5th administration saints who were redeemed out of all nations and tongues, etc. So they are former Gentiles who believe. In Revelation 5, they've already been to the Bema and received their rewards and heavenly assignments. So I don't know of anybody else who's made that key identification of the 24, but I hope there are some. And this is in the hereafter portion of the book Revelation that begins with chapter 4. So it is after the gathering together. Now, to make this identification, one must have their administrations right, especially number 5 and number 6. And they have to have placed the gathering together in the right place, and also have acknowledged the influence the great mystery imposes on prophecy, especially that Jesus could not have known the mystery. He did have comprehensive knowledge of the kingdom of heaven, and that was derived from his study of the Old Testament and revelation from his heavenly Father, and that's the basis for the Olivet Discourse. But at that time, the great mystery was still hidden in God alone. Also, the state of the dead must be correctly understood, that they are dead. They are completely dead, with absolutely no consciousness. Completely dead. And they stay dead until they are raised in one of 3 resurrections. So, those elders, the 24 elders on the thrones, had to be in a resurrection. They said that they were redeemed by the Lamb, and they also said that the group included Gentiles. So the only ones that fit that have to be Christians, and the only resurrection that qualifies is the gathering together. So all the others who don't believe these pivotal truths have not been able to identify the 24, and therefore they cannot clearly pinpoint where Revelation 5 and 6 are on the heavenly timeline. Again, I really have to stress we have to hold firm to our knowledge concerning the dead. The errors commonly believed in our modern society were brought into Christianity from paganism by the Apocrypha. The books of Enoch, Tobit, Esdras, and Maccabees contain elements of this heresy about the dead. Where do the dead actually go upon death? They go to the grave and are in a state of death where there's absolutely no consciousness until they are raised. Ecclesiastes is very clear. Look at Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 3 through 10. He reads, "This is an evil among all things that are done under the sun, that there is one event unto all. Yea, also the heart of the sons of men is full of evil, and madness is in their heart while they live, and after that they go to the dead. For to him that is joined to all the living there is hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. For the living know that they shall die, but the dead know not anything. Neither have they any more a reward, for the memory of them," and it actually is their memory, "is forgotten." They have no memory. Verse 6, "Also their love and their hatred and their envy is now perished. Neither have they any more a portion forever in anything that is done under the sun." Verse 7, "Go your way, eat your bread with joy, drink your wine with a merry heart. For now God accepts your works. Let your garments be always white, and let your head lack no ointment. Live joyfully with the wife whom thou lovest all the days of the life of thy vanity, which he hath given thee under the sun, all the days of thy vanity, for that is thy portion in this life, and in thy labor which thou hast taken under the sun." Verse 10, "Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with all your might, for there is no work, nor device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave whither thou goest." So that is very clear. So I know that a lot of people don't believe this way, but do you want to argue with Solomon? See, Are the Dead Alive Now book is a good reference for this subject. Now, I was going to write a sequel named No. But then a fellow researcher found a book on the subject written in the 1870s, which is very thorough, and that one is available on archive.org. So all you have to do is just go to archive.org on the internet and go to the Advanced tab down at the bottom, and then type in Aaron Ellis, E-L-L-I-S, in the Creator tab. and then click search. And his book named Truth versus Tradition, great title, will come up. And then you can click on it and download it in PDF format for free. It's very comprehensive. So, look at Acts chapter 2. There's another verse on the dead. Acts chapter 2, verse 29, and then verse 34. Peter says, Men and brethren, let me freely speak unto you of the patriarch David, that he is both dead and buried, and his sepulchre is with us unto this day. And then later on he says, For David is not ascended into the heavens. So, if David's not ascended into the heavens, and he was one of the greatest believers of the Old Testament, well, what about all those other people? See, another verse that needs to be addressed is in Matthew 27. It says that there are saints which supposedly arose and witnessed to many when Jesus died. But I believe that is a forgery. When Reverend Cummins went to Munster, Germany for a year, he found one of the oldest Bible commentaries did not have these verses in Matthew 27. I'm going to read in a moment. That commentary must have quoted an older manuscript which is no longer in existence. So Matthew 27, verse 50, it says, Jesus, when he had cried again with a loud voice, yielded up the ghost. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent. Then verse 52 is where I think the forgery begins. And the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose, and came out of the graves after his resurrection, and went into the holy city, and appeared unto many. I believe that verse 52 and 53 are not genuine. But if you just read it, the fact that something is odd should be apparent. The timeline is even broken, because it says an earthquake happened when Jesus died, and the veil of the temple tore, and the graves were opened. But then the saints did not supposedly arise until after his resurrection, 3 days later. Were they procrastinating? I mean, Asaph's grave was opened and he was seen erasing his musical scores. He was decomposing. Sorry about that. The graves were opened, but the saints supposedly did not arise until after his resurrection 3 days later? That doesn't make sense. There was a second earthquake 3 days later in Matthew 28:2 when Jesus arose. Why wasn't that the one that got them up? Now, also at Pentecost, 7 weeks later, Peter declared, when he was speaking by the Spirit, that David is both dead and buried. So, of all the quote-unquote saints who could have gotten up, he didn't. I mean, did they go back to bed in their graves? Furthermore, it calls the Old Testament believers saints. They are never called saints in the Bible. Do a word study, you'll see. Only New Testament believers are called saints. Furthermore, the phrase bodies of the saints, they arose, that's weird. It also calls Jerusalem the holy city. I mean, all of these anomalies smack of some religious monkeying with the text. There was nothing holy about that city then. The inhabitants had just conspired and succeeded to kill the Messiah. So, for me, all of these things don't pass the smell test. Alright? In 1 Corinthians 15, verse 20 through 23, it says, But now is Christ risen from the dead, and become the first fruits of them that slept. Well, if Jesus was the first fruits of them that slept, then all of those other guys that got up couldn't have gotten up, because he was first. You see? And are there any exceptions? No. As in Adam, all die. Okay? Even Jesus died. And even when he was dead, he was completely dead. No consciousness, as dead as Adam. He did not visit the spirits in prison when he was dead. He was dead. That happened after he was raised from among the dead. Enoch and Elijah also were not exceptions. Hebrews 11:13, after it mentions Enoch, it says these all died. So even Enoch died. Okay? Romans chapter 5, verse 12 through 14 is true. It says, verse 12, wherefore as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed on all men, for all have sinned. So, all those guys in the Old Testament, there was no atoning sacrifice good enough. No one was totally righteous. Everyone had sinned. So, without a sacrifice effective like Jesus Christ, they couldn't be raised. It would have been illegal. It would not have happened. See. Now, another thing that we know after we have understood the state of the dead, a second thing we know about the book of Revelation is that we know key facts about the martyrs that were under the altar in the fifth seal. We know key facts about them. The white robes were given unto every one of them, and it was said to them that they should rest for a little season until their fellow servants also and their brethren that should be killed as they were should be fulfilled. So they were killed, and they should rest yet a little season. So they were still dead. So therefore the cry for vengeance had to be figurative, just like Abel's blood calling for vengeance from the ground after he had died. But since these are after the 24 elders in that sequence, they also have to be sixth administration. And they are dead martyrs, and the only time that people get up is in resurrections. So the gathering together had already occurred, and it says they are still dead, so they are awaiting the next resurrection in sequence, which would be the resurrection of the just. So those things we already know from the past session. This teaching tonight is based upon 3 separate studies of the book of Revelation and a study done by E.W. Bullinger on the nature of prophecy. The first study is my white paper on the mighty voices of the book of Revelation. That analyzes the book from the standpoint of the influence of the repetitions of the word voice. It's repeated 56 times. And when something is repeated that much, it has an effect. It has a great influence on the book. I think that prior attempts to understand the book of Revelation have been made difficult because of all the grandiose images that are there. I mean, how do you deal with those awesome things? Some of them are so vivid, you just can't get them out of your head or weigh the next events because they're so awesome. I explain it like one can't see the forest for the trees because the trees are screaming. But the fact that the word voice is used so much, it actually controls the context, not the awesome images. In that paper, I saw that the book of Revelation was not chronological, but it was divided up into layers. And then each layer dealt with the events from its own perspective, not necessarily chronological. See, we in our Western thinking, we want things to be chronological. For example, the book of Jeremiah is not chronological. It is structured on a different basis, and you can see what that is from Bullinger's notes. Now, the second study that this teaching is based on was sent to me by another believer, and it proposed the synchronization of the Olivet Discourse with the 7 seals in the book of Revelation. And I thought that was great, although I did disagree with his conclusions in the paper. And so I wrote my own version, which shows how the events match. But they are in the 6th administration and not the 5th administration. Because of that, I now believe that Jesus gave us the best timeline for the entire book of Revelation in the Olivet Discourse. So we should fit our studies around Jesus' timeline. And then the third study is where I revisited the first one and did another pass through Revelation, and I fit more events into the timeline. Counting the opening vision in the book of Revelation, I count 27 separate visions in the entire book. That is very interesting. 27 is 9 times 3. Judgment perfected. Wow. Now, the hereafter section of the book of Revelation has a lot of visions beginning there. I saw and I heard is repeated quite a bit throughout the book. And these 27 visions, minus the opening and the closing, so there would be 25 of them, are in 4 layers. And each layer has its own set of repetitions. Now, because these are separate visions, they may not be chronological, after one, after another, after another, after another, because they are in each layer, and each layer has a different cause. For example, the seals layer, the seals, that was a legal document, and the seals layer, that's the second layer, it sets up all the legal causes for the judgments. So you have the first layer, which is Revelation chapter 4 and chapter 5, and that first layer is praise. The 4 beasts and the 24 elders are praising God and lauding the Lord Jesus Christ, and they appear on and off throughout, and this praise comes on and off throughout the whole book. So it's the basis for everything. Then the second layer begins with the seals being opened in Revelation chapter 6, verse 1, and it goes through the end of the measuring of the temple, and the 2 witnesses talked about in Revelation chapter 11, verse 1. And the theme with this one is the seals. Then, in Revelation 1:19, it begins the third layer, and this third layer, the actual chapter marking is in the wrong place. Revelation 12, when it first starts, the whole tone of the book changes, so you can see that has to be a section. Something changed, but most people don't realize the chapter marking is in the wrong place, and the last verse in chapter 11 actually sets up the theme for this third layer, and that theme is the temple of God is coming to earth. So in order for that to happen, the earth has to be cleaned up. That begins in Revelation 11, verse 19, just before 12:1. And in that layer, in the third layer, there are references to all the different parts of the temple. It's repeated throughout. So that's very interesting. Then the fourth layer, I believe, begins in Revelation 16:17. And this is the 7th plague, and it talks about the judgment of the whore and all the things having to do with that. So those are the 4 layers, and I'm going to give you this list of the 27 different visions. I'm going to give that to you in the notes, but it's very interesting to see how that all fits. Now, another thing I need to talk about is last week I made a big point about the impenetrable barrier. I really threw down the gauntlet on that one. And I've got to acknowledge my audience. You see, when I wrote my books, I envisioned the audience I wanted to reach like authors should. And I know my ministry is to mature Christians throughout Christendom. I write at a college level to mature Christians. And I'm sorry, occasionally I use some advanced words, but that's just, I had no friends in elementary school except math, science, and music and the thick books in the elementary school library, so that's where I got my vocabulary from. But when I teach, when I explain this, I have learned that I've got to acknowledge some of my Christian brothers that I may not agree with, especially in light of Romans 14, and of course then what we saw in Revelation 2 and 3 in the sermon from heaven. So I need to be ecumenical. There's mature Christians all over the world, and many of them are not being fed spiritually, so I want to try to help. So I need to talk about this impenetrable barrier to them. I need to put myself in their shoes. They may have been taught different stuff, so I can't judge and blame them because they believe differently than I do. And what good does condemnation and fear motivation do? It only divides and antagonizes. So if I'm ever going to get to first base with any of them, I better be loving and respectful. So I have to curb the snide remarks. In my feistier days, I used to do that a lot. So occasionally stuff still slips through. So last week when I taught, I felt bad about that comment I made about rubbing their nose in their Bibles. That's why I said later, I rub my own nose in my Bible too. So, there's worse places to rub noses, I guess. Christians are good people. They're moral. They care about being right. They love God. So I need to give them a lot of credit for that. So I need to appeal to their noble side. And that noble side is what characterized the Bereans in Acts chapter 17. And in verse 11, it talks about the Bereans. They were more noble than those in Thessalonica in that they received the word with all readiness of mind, and they searched the Scriptures daily whether those things were so. Therefore, many of them believed, and also the honorable women, which were Greeks, and of the men not a few. So, that's my ideal audience. I'm looking for Bereans. I love people like Bereans, and I want to teach them the keys and set the framework of truth so they can take them further than I have. In my research and teaching, I've been like a butterfly, flitting from flower to flower, slurping a little nectar from each one, from each truth. But then there's tons of flowers, because God is awesome. Each flower represents a future seed, a subject that can grow and profit and produce more fruit. And that is what Bereans do. They check things out, they study and make things their own, and then they understand truths and they can produce fruit. So that's why I love you guys. You're not just listening, you're checking things out further. Like we talked about earlier, you can see how this all fits. And I love your questions. They're not a challenge to me at all. I'm not afraid of questions. Because if I'm wrong, I want to find out why, and I want to get on the truth. And sometimes questions help me do that. They also point me in the direction of finding truths that I ordinarily may not have considered. So, I am sure that someone in my future audience is going to wonder about how impenetrable that barrier is. So, I need to educate a little bit about prophecy. Most Christians think that the prophet's function is foretelling the future. Well, they do some of that, but actually it is a minor part of a prophet's job. Their main function is to speak for God. That is forth-telling, F-O-R-T-H, telling, and not foretelling, F-O-R-E, telling. They reprove and correct, they encourage and restore, and actually I picture the 5 ruling ministries as arm positions, okay? An apostle is like someone standing with their arms straight up, like a touchdown, reaching up to God for answers and light. Then the evangelist has their arms at a 45-degree angle upward to hail the good news. A prophet has their arms horizontal, both to act as a barrier, but also to protect and encourage us to stay congregated. The pastor has their arms at a 45-degree angle downward to reach the downtrodden and comfort them. And the teacher has their arms straight forward to reach out to all and to enlighten. Then the other ministries complete the picture. The merciful ones are on one knee and have both arms straight down to pull up the injured so they can stand again. The giver has one hand straight out with palm up. The leader has one arm straight out at a 45-degree angle pointing upward. The encourager is beckoning with one arm, and the workers on both knees lifting something up with their arms. So, when I write my book on the one body, these will appear in outlined figures at the beginning of each section on each ministry. That's going to be cool. So, what we're handling is this impenetrable barrier that prophets have with their prophecies, and with especially a foretelling function. The first thing is that we mature Christians, I think, we need to get real. What do I mean by that? Well, we've got to get rid of Hollywood. Real prophets are not as Hollywood portrays. The Harry Potter series has done great damage to our culture, promoting spiritualism and witchcraft. Real prophets are folks like you and me that care about accuracy and truth and want to help. They are here am I, send me types. The going in the trances and acting weird like Hollywood portrays is not the norm. Now, I know Ezekiel was out there, but most of the prophets got their info when they were praying or involved helping people in day-to-day life situations. So this is Bible prophecy. It's not Edgar Casey going into trances. It's not Ouija boards and automatic writing. It's not pagan prophecy. Okay, well, we had some technical difficulties, but we overcame that. So, yes, sometimes prophets can lapse into prophet lingo. I call that prophecy speak. It can be ethereal sounding speech, and it can be full of symbolism. It may be fuzzy, but when it comes to pass, it fits. And did you know that there is a specific set of images that I have found in biblical prophecy? I call it the Prophetic Glossary, in which all of the prophets, all the way from Moses all the way through, used the same imagery to symbolize the same things. For example, horns in visions symbolize kings. Now, the Apocrypha do not use these same symbols because they're not God-breathed. And I've been keeping a list of this prophetic glossary, and as I learn more, I add to it. Now, the next misconception that we in Western culture need to rectify is that biblical prophecy is Semitic in both culture and language. You know that all the writers of Scripture were Semitic except one? Luke was the only writer from Greek culture. However, the book of Luke deals much with what Jesus spoke, and he spoke in Aramaic, a Semitic language. So there's actually only one book of the Bible that was really written according to Greek culture, and that's the book of Acts. So if we want to be accurate regarding the Old Testament and the book of Revelation prophecy, we need to learn to think like Semites. Well, how do you do that? You have to compare Scripture with Scripture, and you have to do word studies. That's the only way that I have found to reliably achieve that goal. I was talking about the misconception that most people have is that when they read the Bible according to their Western culture, they think they understand it. And some people believe that the Holy Spirit can guide us when we read, and that's true. But sometimes when people read Semitic culture-influenced passages with a Western culture mindset, and when they come to a Western-influenced conclusion, they think the Holy Spirit told them that. Well, that is how a lot of error gets into the Bible. You see, when we are reading the Bible, what are we reading? Well, we're reading a translation. Well, what kind of translation is it? Is it literal? Is it idiomatic? Is it a paraphrase? Well, if it's the latter of the two, idiomatic or a paraphrase, I say beware. Why? Because those last two are only as good as the translator. Those last two, the idiomatic and the paraphrase, presuppose that the translator understands the Bible, and so they put their version of things forward using their own words. Well, often they gloss over biblical culture, repetitions, and other figures of speech. The paraphrases pump their theology even worse. Therefore, anyone reading an idiomatic version or a paraphrase version is being disserved. And you can look up on the internet what kind of version the Bible that you have is. So that's why I like to stick with King James, because it is a literal translation. Plus, there is so much reference books based upon it that you can still use it. Now, the these and thous are not that bad. Well, then, what about the NIV? Everybody is using it. Our church wants to keep up with the Joneses. We want to appear modern, and with it. Well, the NIV is an idiomatic version. They think they know what stuff means, so they put it into their own words instead of using the original words. If they're right, that's great. But if they're wrong, you'll never know, because you don't have the literal to work yourself. Because they've glossed over the repetitions, the figures of speech, cultural evidence, and converted the Semitic idioms into what they think it means. Well, were they right? Well, what about stuff that no one's put together yet? The evidence on all of that has been obscured. So, I'm sorry, there is no shortcut. We've got to study the Word. And to me, concurrence is the key that can get around such errors. But only if you're using a literal translation. What I mean by concurrence is you look at all the verses on the subject. See, now, some people might not like that work. Some people say, well, it's not fair. It's supposed to be simple. Lord, it's too complicated. Well, Jesus said that some seeing won't see, and some hearing won't hear. He said the apostles were given to know the mysteries. Why? Because Semitic learning is earned and not just dished out. So, I'm sorry, but if some people don't like that, don't complain to me. Complain to the management. Okay? We've got to work to get back to the original and understand what was in the mind of the prophet when they wrote what they wrote. This is especially required when evaluating prophecy, because shades of meaning may make a great difference. So we need to evaluate from the Hebrew and Greek text and not from what some translator thinks. Or we have to use a literal translation. The Rotherham version is good. It's called the Emphasized Bible. You can use word studies, and there are bread and butter. That's the only real way to get to some of this stuff. But there are many Western culture Christians who think they understand the Bible, but they actually don't, because they're evaluating it via Western Aristotelian logic from Aristotle instead of Semitic thought. And another very important thing is we have to understand the nature of biblical prophecy. There are many so-called experts in biblical prophecy who are really not experts at all. Wow. How can I say that? They do know a lot of stuff, but they're like Saul before he became the Apostle Paul. It's stacked wrong. Saul needed the key of who Jesus really was, and then it reshuffled into proper order. And then he was really able to teach the word powerfully. So, there are some keys to prophecy, and we need to go to school. We need to go to prophet school to see how biblical prophecy really works. The greatest work on biblical prophecy was written by Salamo Glacius, but it's in Latin, and it's never been translated. And it was part of his massive work on figures of speech. I think it was in the 15th or 16th century. Fortunately, E.W. Bullinger adapted his work, so we will be able to utilize what he wrote in his Figures of Speech book. This work, I believe, is the seminal work on biblical quotations and prophecy, and it should be understood by all students of the Bible, especially those who say that they specialize in prophecy. If one is not mindful of this work, they may fall prey to anachronistic, modern culture, prophetic interpretations, and have unrealistic expectations of foretold events. There's no other way to learn the nuances of prophecy other than to consider the examples that Bullinger gives. If we take the time to do so, we will not be approaching the subject from a modern theoretical standpoint, but from a real ancient-minded and practical one. So I'm going to include in the notes, the supplemental notes, a copy of the chapter on quotations. The figure of speech is called Gnome, G-N-O-M-E. Now, there's one thing that you have to understand when something is quoted in the Bible, and that is, it's quoted for a reason. Okay? There's a purpose behind each quote to prove or corroborate or illustrate. So, what you're supposed to do with a quote, whenever you have one, is go back into the Old Testament where this quote came from and look at the context around that quote, because that is why it was quoted. It was quoted to illustrate something. So if you go back to the Old Testament and look at the passage, then import the context of that quote into the New, you'll have much greater understanding of the New Testament passage. I'm not going to read this whole thing by Bullinger, but he gets into Gnome, and one of the big issues that all the theologians are concerned with is how the New Testament scriptures harmonize with their Old Testament original counterparts. And there's a problem with that. The problem is that the New Testament manuscripts, there's a few in the second, there's much more in the 3rd and 4th and 5th century manuscripts. A lot of them are Greek manuscripts. There are some Aramaic, of course, but the preponderance of biblical manuscripts, and what I mean by manuscript is hand script writing. It's written by hand, not printed on a printing press. So these manuscripts are mainly Greek. And there are many entire Bibles that exist, like Codex Sinaiticus or Codex Vaticanus. Those are entire Bibles written in Greek, and they have the Old Testament in Greek in them. The Old Testament in Greek is called the Septuagint because supposedly it was translated by 70 scholars, and it was done in Alexandria of Egypt in about 200 or so BC. Well, the translators, when they translated the Hebrew into Greek, they were very precise with the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, because those are the basis for Judaism, and they couldn't get away with free, liberal translations of that. Otherwise, the Septuagint would not have been used by the Jews. So they were very good when they translated the Hebrew into the Greek for the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. But after that point, they got pretty liberal and added some things. It became more of an idiomatic translation than a real literal translation. And because of that, some of these quotations that appear in the Septuagint, I don't think were what the prophet originally said. They've added to it. They've put their own personal interpretation into it. And what's interesting is that when Jesus quoted things, he quoted from Hebrew, because there was a separate tradition of the Hebrew text that was copied and faithfully kept by the Masoretes. These were a group of scribes that protected the Hebrew text by analyzing it. They had a bunch of statistics about the character of the text, each page, and the things like that to statistically analyze it. So after they made a copy of the page, they'd run it through all these tests to see if it matched. So that protected the Hebrew text very well. The earliest example of the Hebrew text that we've got are the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then from that point on, the next oldest one is from 900 AD. So there's 1,100 years between the 900 AD text, which is, I think, the Leningrad text of the Hebrew and the Dead Sea Scrolls, but there's very little change because the Masoretes were very good at protecting the text. But back to what I'm talking about, when Jesus quoted the Word, he did not quote the Septuagint. Jesus spoke Aramaic and he spoke Hebrew, so when he was reading in his home synagogue, he was not reading a Septuagint. He was reading a Hebrew text. And so many of the New Testament quotations don't match the Septuagint. And the scholars are concerned about that. Well, I think that if they're different in the New Testament, that's more accurate because it's from a Hebrew text. And one of the things the scribes did is they harmonized the New Testament quotes to match the inaccurate Septuagint. Very interesting to analyze this. And so if you look at Bullinger's section on Gnome, he gets into all these differences between the Septuagint and the New Testament. But he makes a very important comment in here. He analyzes where all these quotes come from, and he shows what books of the Bible they're from, and all of this, and then he makes a comment that the Apocrypha books are not referenced to at all. So in other words, there's no quote from an Apocrypha book in the New Testament. So that speaks volumes. Now some people will say, well, no, wait a minute. Jude quoted Enoch. Well, Jude did not quote the book of Enoch. Bullinger says the book of Enoch wasn't even written yet. The book of Enoch is one of these apocryphal books that claims to be written by someone and could not possibly have been written by them. So if the title is wrong, what about the whole rest of the book? See, no, Jude quoted Hebrew oral tradition because they did memorize things and they had a whole set of traditions, what all the rabbis said, and that was in the Mishnah and the Gemara, which are the oral tradition of the Bible. So Bullinger talks about all the different things that happen with prophecy. See, we in our Western culture thinking, we think that in order for a quotation to be utilized, we have to quote it perfectly. Well, there are some quotes like that in the Bible where it's exact from the Old Testament to the New. But since the Holy Spirit is involved with both ends, both the original quote and then the quotation in the New Testament, sometimes things are changed, things are adapted, things are left out, things are inserted. Well, God is still the author, so Bullinger catalogs all these different types of changes, and then he gives examples. And see, that's where prophecy school is. Okay? Where I really encourage anyone who's concerned about prophecy to work Bullinger's chapter, because he gives all the examples, and then once you see how they used it, then you'll understand prophecy from a Semitic standpoint and not a modern standpoint. Now, Bullinger brings out a very, very interesting point. He says there's a further consideration which will help us when the quotations are prophecies. Prophecy is an utterance of the Lord, Jehovah, He who was and is to come. Therefore, His words may have a past, a present, and a future fulfillment or reference. So, prophecy frequently has all three. The reference to the original event at the time of its utterance or writing. Then, a subsequent reference to some great crisis or event. And then a final consummation which will fulfill and exhaust it. And this is one of the greatest keys to interpreting prophecy. Without it, we're only guessing. We're only applying our modern Western logic instead of thinking like a Semitic person. When prophecy is said to be fulfilled, that exhausts it. In other cases where a final fulfillment is still future, the quotation may be general as it is written, or some other indefinite reference. The mistake made by most students of prophecy consists in this. They do not bear in mind this threefold aspect of prophecy, but take one part and put it for the whole. So, I call those guys one-verse Charlies because they exalt one verse over all the rest. Now, I'm not referring to any particular person named Charles. It's just an expression. For example, Bullinger says, with regard to the prophecy in Daniel 9 about the Abomination of Desolation, we're going to get into that a little bit, there is a reference to Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes was a king that had desecrated the temple. And he says Antiochus is a type for the Antichrist. So he is a prophetic example of what the Antichrist is going to be like. But this neither fulfilled nor exhausted the prophecy, which waits for the yet future revelation of one who shall fulfill it in full. While there may be a historical reference to the course of events in between, each is true as part of the general fulfillment, but neither contains the whole truth embodied in the fullness of the prophetic record. So, especially dealing with the Abomination of Desolation, which is a key term in the book of Revelation in eschatology, and in the Olivet Discourse, we have to understand that there can be multiple fulfillments of prophecy. Now, the greatest example of this is the very first prophecy in Matthew, where it says, behold, a virgin shall be with child, and shall bring forth a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. Well, this was prophesied by Isaiah to King Ahaz, who was a king of Israel. And it was that there would be a young woman that would give birth to a child, and before that child grew old enough to speak, then something would happen. Something would be fulfilled. Well, it was fulfilled in part back in 730 BC, roughly. But then it gets quoted for Jesus Christ. So it had a second fulfillment. Now, I differ a little bit with Bullinger on what he says in his chapter, because one of the things that I have found with multiple fulfillments of prophecy is that they differ by a word meaning either a synonym or they employ a slightly different meaning of a pivotal word. In this case, virgin. So, in Hebrew, a virgin is a young woman. Now, when we think of virgin, we think of something different. Now, what we think of also was an alternate meaning of the word virgin in Hebrew, but it had more than one meaning. So, the first fulfillment of that prophecy fulfilled one meaning of virgin. A young woman gave birth, and by the time the child was old enough to speak, something would occur. But then it was adapted in Matthew. Now see, we think, oh no, we can't do that. We're not quoting the thing exactly. But you see, you have to think like a Semitic person and not like a Western Greek Aristotelian person. Okay? And in Semitic thinking, this was permissible. So here in Matthew, the word virgin takes on a different meaning. A young woman who has not had sex yet. And that's the meaning of it when Jesus was born. So, in other words, the prophecy was quoted, but the pivotal thing was that a word changed in meaning. Okay? Now, another thing Bullinger talks about that's very interesting. There's a whole controversy about the 30 pieces of silver, and it was said that it was a prophecy by Jeremiah, and so all the people looked up in Jeremiah and they couldn't find it there, but they did find something similar in Zechariah. So then they have this big argument about the fact that somebody made a mistake someplace. Matthew may have not had a good memory, or they went through all these different conclusions for why Matthew said it was Jeremiah, but it really wasn't Jeremiah, it was Zechariah. But the whole solution of the thing is exactly what the word says. It says it was spoken by Jeremiah. Okay? It wasn't written. It was spoken. Now you see, all of these prophets that we have, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and the prophets in the King's period, and Hosea and Joel and all those guys, well, they were prophets for a long period of time in their lives, and they just didn't speak just the things that are written in the Bible. What was written down actually was a small part of their repertoire of all the things that they had spoken. So, in some cases, Hebrew tradition has preserved the statements of some of these prophets that were never written. And that's the solution to this issue where Matthew said, Jeremiah said it, and the scholars say, no, he didn't. It's not written anywhere. Well, no, Jeremiah did say it. It just wasn't written. And that simply is the solution to that conundrum. So, Bullinger talks about that in his paper. It's very interesting to go through all of this. And then he ends up with, we all constantly quote scriptures, and in adapting them by application to some special circumstance, we depart from the original interpretation as to the special circumstances connected with them, and do not hesitate to change a tense, number, or person. It's no less authoritative as Scripture, nor does it alter the Word of God. Now, I don't have time to go through all Bullinger's discussion on Nome, so I'm going to give it to you in the notes. But there's a couple extra things that I want to say that aren't in there. The first thing was, it's quoted for a reason, so you go back and you look at the context and then you import that forward. Another thing is, there are other nuances regarding prophecy. So, can prophecy change? And the answer is yes, when circumstances change. But when prophecy is given twice, it's established, right? Now, we get that from Genesis 41:32, and for that the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. So this is talking about the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. Well, Jesus prophesied that the temple would be destroyed twice. The first time he prophesied it was in Luke 19:44, and that was during Jesus' second entrance into the city. And then the next time was Luke 21, verse 5 and 6. And that was a day or so later, and it was actually a few hours before he spoke the Olivet Discourse. So, the fact that the temple would be destroyed was repeated. It was given twice. So that prophecy won't change. And of course it did happen in 70 AD. Now, I got into all of this because I was talking about the impenetrable barrier. That is that Jesus and the Old Testament prophets did not know the mystery. So, what about any prophecy in the New Testament that seems to indicate that somehow they did? Well, here's one. Look at Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2. And I think that God did this for a reason. Because Acts chapter 2, verse 16, when Peter stood up and spoke, he quotes a prophecy. And this is the first prophecy quoted in the church age. So, this is a precedent. Alright? Acts chapter 2, verse 16 through 21. So, Peter stood up and he spoke. Now, when he said, the word said is the same word as the word uttered when they spoke in tongues. So, he is speaking by inspired utterance. This is straight prophecy. Alright? This is speaking by the Holy Spirit. Acts chapter 2, verse 16. It says, but this is that which is spoken by the prophet Joel. And it shall come to pass in the last days, saith God, I will pour out of my Spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. And on my servants and on my handmaidens will I pour out in those days of my Spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will show wonders in heaven above, and signs in the earth beneath, and blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before that great and notable day of the Lord come. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. So, this is the prophecy in Acts. Now, let's go back to Joel, and let's read the original one in Joel. Joel chapter 2, verse 28. It says, And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions, and also upon the servants and upon the handmaidens in those days will I pour out my Spirit, and I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. And the sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before that great and terrible day of the Lord come. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be delivered. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem shall be deliverance, as the Lord hath said, in the remnant whom the Lord shall call. So, the question is, was Joel prophesying of the church age? Well, I thought there was an impenetrable barrier. I thought that the church was hidden. But why did Peter quote this? Well, first of all, you have to ask the question, was Joel intending this for the church? Let's read on in Joel and we will see. Joel chapter 3 verse 1. For behold, in those days and in that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations, and will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage, Israel, whom they've scattered among the nations and parted my land. Well, that didn't happen when Peter quoted this in Acts 2. That's going to happen in the future because the lost 10 tribes of Israel and all the people who are related to the Jews are scattered around the world, and this is a prophecy they're going to be brought back together. Why? Because in the 6th administration, the congregation is going to be the Jews again. Verse 7 of Joel 3. Behold, I will raise them out of the place whither you have sold them, talking about Gentiles, and will return unto your recompense upon your own head, and I will sell your sons and your daughters into the hand of the children of Judah, and they shall sell them to the Sabaeans, to the people afar off, for the Lord hath spoken it. Proclaim ye this among the Gentiles. Prepare war. Wake up the mighty men. Let all the men of war draw near. Let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords, and your pruning hooks into spears, and let the weak say, I am strong. Well, when is that going to happen? That's the battle of Armageddon. So, Joel, when he first prophesied this, he was prophesying this for the future kingdom. He was not prophesying this for the church. Alright? So then, how come the Holy Spirit didn't know about the impenetrable barrier? No, these things were expected in the future kingdom. But God adapted this for the church. How can I say that? Because the Spirit used a different meaning of one word. And this is what happens with multiple fulfillments. See? There was a fulfillment that's still future, and then there was another fulfillment, but that one was secret. And the original prophecy was that whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be delivered. But in the New Testament, it was adapted and changed to saved, not delivered. Alright? Now, all salvation is a form of deliverance, but not all deliverance is salvation, i.e., receiving a ticket to heaven or paradise. And also, Peter did not quote the last half of the verse in Joel 2:32. Why? Because it didn't apply. It's like when Jesus was in his home synagogue in Luke 4. He went up to a certain point and he stopped right in the middle of the verse and didn't quote the rest of the verse, because if they had, the whole Bible would fall to pieces. Right? So, in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem shall be deliverance, as the Lord said, and in the remnant whom the Lord shall call. That only pertained to the future. Okay? Now, there's also one more difference. In Joel, how much of the Spirit will be poured out. All of it. In Acts, how much of the Spirit was poured out. The earnest, a portion. But who knew that? Only God. So the impenetrable barrier is still intact. And I think that the fact that this is the very first prophecy spoken in the church age sets the precedence. See? Now, the 12 apostles were a group, and they discussed stuff all the time. And I am sure that after this, they all came up to Peter and say, "Wow, what did you just say? Is this really coming to pass? Is this really the end times?" And all Peter could say is, "I don't know. I just spoke it by the Spirit. I knew it was God, but I don't know." Well, there was a lot of things they didn't know that happened on the day of Pentecost because things changed. So many things changed it caused wind. Like when they had speaking in tongues, it was Gentile tongues. God was telling them, "Look, you guys have to go out and talk to the Gentiles." Well, they didn't accept that until many years later. There were certain things that they just didn't know. So I think that this set a precedent and affects all the other prophecies because they're just like this. When the prophet originally prophesied, they were speaking of the kingdom. They were speaking of the sixth administration. See, they were speaking of the end times. And they had no inkling of an iota about the church. But God could adapt it back to us because He did not reinvent the wheel when He gave us what He gave us in the fifth administration. He gave us part of what they're going to get in the sixth administration. And so that's why the prophecies seem to predict what would happen in the church age, but they were not intending that. They were intending it to be for the sixth administration. So I think that's pretty clear. So now we're ready to talk about the book of Revelation a little bit more here. Look at Revelation chapter 12. Revelation chapter 12, verse 1. This is really a unique prophecy. Revelation 12:1 and following. It says, "And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth and pain to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up unto God and to His throne." Now, this is very interesting stuff, because later on it says that there was a war in heaven. Verse 7. "And Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought against his angels, and prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceives the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him." Now, what's happening here is these events appear to be all jumbled up, because the great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, now we know that to have happened in 3 BC on September the 11th, Tishri the 1st, on the night that Jesus was born. And also, verse 3, "There appeared another wonder in heaven. There actually was a meteor shower that night. His tail drew in the third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth." There actually was a meteor shower that night, and the radiant where all the meteors appeared to emanate from in the sky was from Eta Draconis, the 7th brightest star in the constellation of Draco, and it is in the tail. So we know those things happened in 3 BC. Then verse 5, "And she brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations." Well, that's Jesus. And that happened that night in 3 BC. But then there was a war in heaven. Well, when did that happen? That happened way back before Genesis 1:2, in between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. and the dragon was cast out, and all his angels were cast out with him. See, this prophecy is really interesting because it is timeless. This is not given in a chronological time. Time is not an issue in this section. It is juxtaposing events based upon a different criteria other than lineal time. Well, what criteria is it? Well, if you look at chapter 12, verse 1, it seems that's where the prophecy starts. But actually, you have to go one verse earlier to Revelation 11:19, because the chapter marking is in the wrong spot. Revelation 11:19, it says, "And the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen." So this is a new vision. "And there was seen in his temple the ark of his testament, and there were lightnings and voices and thunderings and an earthquake and a great hail." Now, one of the things that I saw in the 4 different layers is this phrase, "There were lightnings and voices and thunderings." This phrase is repeated 4 times, usually at the beginning of each layer. There's only one layer where it's not at the beginning. But there's 4 occurrences of this lightnings and voices and thunderings, and so that's why I'm saying there's 4 layers, because I understand the role of repetitions, and phrase repetitions are used usually as context markers that start new paragraphs or new sections. Now, it also adds an earthquake and a great hail, so this is on steroids. But anyway, this is the beginning of the layer, and so the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in his temple the ark of the testament. Now, when you look at each layer, then you'll see the different words that are repeated. And like I said, the 3rd layer repeats words that refer to all the different parts of the temple. So this is the issue in Revelation 12. God's temple coming down to earth, and it is giving the spiritual criteria for this. Now, another thing that I wanted to do is I wanted to show how each of these layers is not necessarily chronological, but they go and they retell the same sequence of events. So, for example, the first seal was the white horse, and on the white horse was someone with a bow and with a crown, and they went to overcome. Well, here in Revelation 13, verse 1 through 6, begins another vision, and it says, "I stood upon the sand of the sea." Revelation 13, verse 1, "I stood upon the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy." Well, these heads and horns and crowns are the kingdom of the devil in the one world empire that's going to exist in the future. And it says, "And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth was the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as if it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world wondered after the beast, and they worshipped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who shall be able to make war with him? And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven." So, who is this beast? It is the Antichrist. Well, if you look at the sequence of events, we know that right after the gathering together occurs, then that wicked shall be revealed. Because he who holds the adversary back will be taken out of the way, like it says in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. So, the Antichrist is going to come on the scene. And the adversary is not going to waste any time. As soon as we are out of the way, the mystery of iniquity doth already work. He already has somebody in line right now who could be the Antichrist after the gathering together. But he doesn't know when the gathering together is, so he's got to be ready every generation with someone and a whole support structure to support him. And so it's working even now. So Revelation 13:1 is in layer 3, but it fits with the first seal, because the first seal has someone wearing a crown, and they have a bow. Well, what does a bow shoot? A bow shoots arrows. Well, who shoots the fiery darts? The adversary does. See, so this is the Antichrist, and so Revelation 13:1 is retelling the same set of events that the second layer tells. See, so that's why I'm saying the whole book of Revelation is not chronological. It's in 4 layers, and each layer may retell certain events. Now, I said that this fits with the first seal, where Jesus loosed the first seal. Okay, well, this is talking about the Antichrist. Well, why did Jesus loose the seal? Well, it's the Hebrew idiom of permission. He is releasing all the legal processes that are at work to bring about judgment. And yes, the adversary conquers, but ultimately it'll turn back on him, and he shall be conquered. See? Now, Revelation 13:7. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and overcome them, and power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. So this is the one world government, and he'll make war, he'll overcome them. Now, this is the red horse of the second seal, who takes peace, that they should kill one another. Now, Jesus foretold in the Olivet Discourse wars and rumors of wars, and nation against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. Well, when this Antichrist takes over all kindreds and tongues and nations, they're not going to come peacefully. There's going to be a big war. Okay? Revelation 13, verse 15. Here we'll read on. And he had power to give life to the image of the beast, and to the image of the beast that should both speak, and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. And he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Revelation 13, verse 15 through 17, corresponds with the black horse of the third seal, who had the scales. And what were they saying? That wheat and barley was for a penny, right? For a denarius. They were selling the food at a really inflated price. So this is the mark of the beast that no one can sell or buy without. You see, Revelation 13, 15 through 17, this is layer 3, corresponds in the third seal, is in layer 2, and then Jesus talks about famines in the Olivet Discourse. So you see how the pattern's fitting? It's just retelling the story in each layer from a different standpoint. Now, the fourth seal was the pale horse, and was followed by death and hell. And it says, and power was given unto them over a fourth part of the earth, to kill with the sword, with hunger, with death, and with the beasts of the earth. So, in Revelation 9 in layer 2, it's retelling this. The sixth angel sounded in Revelation 9 verse 13. The sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the 4 horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, loose the 4 angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. And the 4 angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year. That's a date. Okay? They were ready for this date. That was an hour on a day, in a month, in a year, to slay a third part of men. And the number of the army of the horsemen were 200 million, and I heard the number of them. And I saw the horses in the vision, and them that sat on them. So these horses run through, and they kill a whole lot of people. And these are the unbelievers. If you read on, verse 18, by these three, the third part of men, these are the unbelievers, were killed by the fire, by the smoke, by the brimstone that issued out of the mouths of these horses. So, and this is all figurative, but it gives all these numbers. Earlier it said 1/4 of the people on the whole earth will die. Well, that's 1/4 of both believers and unbelievers. Here it's 1/3, and these people have to be unbelievers, so the numbers will still fit. Revelation 18, verse 8 through 10. This is in layer 4. Therefore shall her plagues come in one day, death and mourning and famine. She, Babylon, will utterly be burned with fire. So when Babylon is destroyed, a whole big bunch of people are going to die, and that is in keeping with the pale horse, which is in the second layer. So it's retelling the story, but just giving more details in each layer. Revelation 19 is another one. This is in the 4th layer. Revelation 19, verse 17. And I saw an angel standing in the sun, and he cried with a loud voice, saying to all the fowls that fly in the midst of heaven, come and gather yourselves together unto the supper of the great God, that you may eat the flesh of kings, and the flesh of captains, and the flesh of mighty men, and the flesh of horses, and of them that sit on them, and the flesh of all men, both free and bond, both small and great. So in the battle of Armageddon, there's going to be a lot of people killed. So this is the 4th seal. See, that sets in motion, and then each of the layers talks about this. So finally, the 5th seal is vengeance, and in Revelation 18, it talks about Babylon and when Babylon gets what's coming to her. And in Revelation 18, the merchants are saying, alas, alas, the great city was clothed in fine linen and it's coming apart. And then in verse 20, it says, rejoice over her, thou heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God hath avenged you on her. So the 5th seal was vengeance, and now in the 4th layer it retells all the events, and now it's going to fill in more details about how this vengeance is going to be accomplished. It even says in verse 24, Revelation 18:24, for in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and all that were slain upon the earth. So those people under the altar that were saying, avenge us, that's them. Now we're ready to talk about the 6th seal. There's a lot of elements to consider in the 6th seal, but one glaring clue is something that takes the Olivet Discourse completely out of the grace administration and puts it in the 6th administration, and that is Matthew 24, verse 20, where Jesus said, but pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. So Jesus has to be prophesying of a time when the law is back in effect. So it can't be any time in the 5th administration. Remember, Paul clearly says in Colossians 2:16, let no man therefore judge you in meat or drink, respect of a holy day, or of the new moon, or of the Sabbath. So we are not bound by the law in this administration to observe the Sabbath. Now, of course, in Romans, we don't sin that grace may abound. So we have a greater law, the law of love. But still, we don't have to let anyone judge us in respect of a holy day and of the Sabbath. Another thing is in Matthew 24:13 and in Mark 13:13, Jesus said, but he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. Well, wait a minute. How do we get saved? Is that how we get saved? No. We get saved by Romans 10:9, right? We make Jesus Christ our Lord, we confess Him with our mouth, and we believe that God raised him from among the dead, right? So, again, when Jesus is prophesying in the Olivet Discourse, he has to be prophesying of sixth administration, salvation. See? Now, this is really interesting, because in the fourth administration, what was the criteria for salvation? He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, right? In the fifth administration, what is the criteria for salvation? Romans 10:9. You confess that Jesus is your Lord and believe God raised him from among the dead. In the sixth administration, what is the criteria for salvation? He that endures to the end shall be saved. You see, 3 different criteria for salvation. See, isn't that interesting? Then, when Jesus said this, in Matthew 24, verse 13 and 14, he said, Matthew 24, 13, 14, but he that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. Well, if you look up the word gospel, the phrase gospel of the kingdom is not used in the epistles. The gospel of the kingdom is referenced in the four gospel era, but in the fifth administration, it's called the gospel of Christ, it's called the gospel of God, it's called the gospel of the grace of God. And then in the sixth administration, it's called the gospel of the kingdom again. You see how all this fits? So Jesus has to be prophesying of the sixth administration. See? Now, Jesus said it'll be preached in all the world. Well, in layer 3, in Revelation 14, verse 6, it gives more corroborating information about that, where it says that I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, to every nation and kindred and tongue and people. You see? So, this is really interesting to see how this all fits. How each layer retells the same events. See? So now we're going to pick up some more in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24. Go ahead and turn to Matthew 24, verse 15. Matthew 24, 15. Jesus now gets very specific, and he says, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, and then it says, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee unto the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. So in other words, you got to get out of Dodge now. Okay? No dilly-dallying. Leave now. Verse 18, neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. The clothes were the most valuable things that they had in that era. So then, Mark says the same basic thing, and Luke says the same basic thing. And then Luke goes on to say, for those be the days of vengeance, that in all things which are written may be fulfilled. So, this abomination of desolation is a very interesting thing. It was prophesied by Daniel, and this is a term that's unique to Jewish and Christian eschatology. It actually refers to a pagan desecration of the altar in the temple. See, the temple has existed in 2 different forms, 2 different buildings. Solomon's temple existed until 586 BC when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed it. Then it lay in ruins for the 70-year captivity. Then Ezra and Nehemiah came, and Ezra rebuilt the second temple, and that was finished during the reign of Darius the First in Persia. And then that same temple was remodeled by Herod, and that was the temple that Jesus ministered in. And then this second temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. Now, there will be a third temple in the future, because it talks about that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, that the Antichrist, the wicked one, will show that he is in the temple, that he is God. So there has to be a temple existing in the future in order for that to happen. And there's a group of people that want to build it, so they're going to try to hasten the book of Revelation to come to pass, because they know the book of Revelation can't happen without a temple, and they want to build a temple so they make the book of Revelation happen sooner. Well, God's going to do it on His own timetable, and nobody who tries to be the finger of God is going to succeed. All right? Now, in order to understand the Abomination of Desolation, we have to take into account the stuff that we learned from Bullinger and the fact that there could be multiple fulfillments of it. So, there will have to be multiple fulfillments of this. Now, the word abomination is a term that refers to a desecration or paganism. And then desolation means ruin or destruction. So when Solomon's temple was destroyed, that was a desolation. But Nebuchadnezzar did not desecrate the altar or do a pagan sacrifice on it or do anything of the kind. So there was not an abomination of desolation that occurred after the first temple was destroyed in 586 BC. But there was an abomination that did occur by Antiochus, who was a Seleucid king. If you put it on the timeline, the children of Israel were carried away into Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. There were several kings, and then Cyrus the Persian from Iran area conquered Babylon, and Cyrus let all the people that wanted to go back to Jerusalem, he let them go back, and he financed the rebuilding of their temple. That's Ezra. And then Nehemiah actually was in the court of the Persian king, and the reason that Nehemiah was there was because of the influence of Esther and Mordecai. There's a whole bunch of information on that in a paper that I have on academia.org about who the king was during Esther. But anyway, in the 20th year of that king, who happened to be Darius I, Nehemiah came back to Jerusalem and he built the wall. So then, after that, Alexander the Great conquered Persia. But Alexander the Great's reign was only a few years, and then he died prematurely, and his kingdom was split up into 4 parts. And the southern part in Egypt was led by a group of kings by the name of Ptolemy, Ptolemy. And then north of Judea was another capital for another king that ruled as part of Alexander the Great's empire, and they were the Seleucids, and Judah was in between the two. And there were times that the Ptolemies controlled Judea, and there were times that the Seleucids controlled Judea. And one of the Seleucid kings tried to Greekify Judea, and so he forbade circumcision, and he forbade the observation of Judaism, and he sacrificed a pig on the altar, which desecrated it, and it stayed in a polluted form for 3 years while a revolt occurred. And this is the Maccabean revolt, and they actually won their independence from this king. So anyway, what's really interesting is that Daniel prophesied of all of this in Daniel chapter 8 during the reign of Belshazzar, who was one of the grandsons of Nebuchadnezzar, I believe. And he prophesies of this whole time, which is so accurate. It talks about the king of Greece coming in. It talks about the kingdom being split into 4 parts. And it's really something. I think what I'm going to do is I'll give you that portion of the notes So you have all that information, because I don't want to overcomplicate things. I know that this is a lot of information. But what's interesting is that this prophecy in Daniel chapter 8 it talks about this king, which was Antiochus, and it says in chapter 8 verse 11, by him was the daily sacrifice taken away. So he took away the daily sacrifice. He made that stop. And Daniel chapter 8 verse 12, and a host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. Verse 13, then I heard one saint speaking to another saint, and said unto that certain saint, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under the foot? And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So, this transgression of desolation that Antiochus did, they predicted that there would be a time span of 2,300 days that the temple would be desecrated. Now, we know about this because this is the origin of Hanukkah. At the end, when they cleansed the temple, they didn't have enough oil, and there was the lamp that's supposed to be burning in the temple, but miraculously it burned for 8 days. So that is the origin of the festival of light of Hanukkah. But they know when the temple was desecrated, and they know when it was cleansed. I'm going to talk about this because the prophecy that I read to you was that it would be 2,300 days before it was cleansed. Now, that 2,300 days is actually 78 lunar months. Lunar months were either 29 or 30 days. And if you look at the book of Maccabees, which talks about this event. The book of Maccabees is an apocrypha book. It's not official, it's not God-breathed, but of all the apocrypha, the books of Maccabees are the most historically accurate. We know that in 2 Maccabees 1:54 and 59, it gives the date. Antiochus set up the abomination. He sacrificed the pig on the altar on the 25th of Chislev. And then the temple was cleaned 3 years later in 2 Maccabees 4:52 on the same day, the 25th of Chislev. But if you look at 2,300 days over those 3 years from one 25th of Chislev to the next 25th of Chislev, it's less than 2,300 days. So the prophecy doesn't seem to fit. But it does say they would be trodden underfoot for 2,300 days. So there's more to it. Now, history records that the temple was rededicated on the 25th in 164 BC, and we can see what the Jewish calendar was like by looking at the research of Parker and Duberstein. They made the Jewish calendar showing how it all fit. The Jewish calendar is lunar, so in order to fit, they have to throw in an extra month every 3 years. They call it second Adar, because if you add up 12 months of alternating 29 and 30-day months, it comes up 11 days short every year. Well, that's going to add up, and pretty soon your spring's going to be in your fall, and your summer's going to be in your winter if you don't adjust. So what the Jews did is every 3 years or so, they had a 13th month. So Parker and Duberstein know when those 13th months were. In their chart, the year 170 and the year 167 BC had 13-month years in them. So we can count back 78 months using all of this from the cleansing of the temple, and that brings us to the end of the month Av, which is the 5th month in 170 AD. And I think this will fit because Antiochus fought the Egyptians that year in November of 170 BC, and that would have been in the middle of the 8th month. So, if the beginning of the 2300 days was on the 26th of Av, this date would have been 80 days before the battle. So, I went to a website called orbis.stanford.edu and calculated how long it would take an army to travel from Damascus to the place where this battle was, and they would pass Jerusalem on the way there. And it's 300 miles from Damascus to the battle site. And so, at the speed of ox carts, it would take 50 days. So, we had 80 days and 50 days. So, it's not implausible that the sanctuary was trodden underfoot by advanced elements from Antiochus's army in the summer of 170 BC. So, I think that the 2300-day figure for the Abomination of Desolation occurred back in 170 BC. So, it was fulfilled at least once. But then, you have the same thing that Jesus mentions, that there would be an abomination of desolation in the Olivet Discourse. And what this comes from is another prophecy in Daniel. Turn to Daniel chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9. See, there are several different fulfillments of this abomination of desolation having to do with the temple. Daniel chapter 9, verse 25 through 29. Here it says, "Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again and the wall, even in troublous times. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself, or have nothing. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate." Now, that is pretty ethereal sounding, but this is a key prophecy that many try to use to span the gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament because of the weeks that are mentioned here, 62 weeks, 70 weeks, etc. And so they try to say that these weeks are weeks of years or sabbatical years. So this 70 weeks turns out to be 490 years. However, in my chronological studies, I have tried every which way you can to try to figure out 490 years from the commandment to restore Jerusalem to all of these events. And there is no formula that I have found to make it all work. And if you look at eschatology on the internet and in all the books, everybody tries every which way to try to make this work. They have predicted all kinds of end-time target dates which have not come to pass. And it really is a mess. Now, the problem also is that most of the eschatologists that try to use this 490-year figure, they don't know exactly when the commandment to restore Jerusalem was. Was it Cyrus, or was it the Persian king that told Nehemiah to go ahead and rebuild? And also, they are incorrect which king, Persian king it was, that Esther was the queen of. They put forth all these different dates, and none of the dates work. Plus, their target date is incorrect as well. most Christian eschatologists and chronologers believe that Jesus Christ was crucified in 33 AD. And we know that is not true because we know the 14th of Nisan had to fall on a Wednesday in order for there to be 3 days and 3 nights between when he died and was buried and when he arose. Well, we can reconstruct the Jewish calendar for that era through the charts that are given by Parker and Duberstein, where they showed how the Jewish calendar worked. Parker and Duberstein showed that there was an intercalary month, a second Adar, that occurred between 27 and 28 AD. And with that, it makes the 14th of Nisan fall on a Wednesday in 28 AD. So we know that Jesus was crucified in 28 AD, not 33. So as I was saying, all the people who try to use this 490-year figure to try to figure out things, they don't know the right starting date and they don't know the right ending date. But they try to show that this last week is the week that the Antichrist is going to come and do some of the things that are in verse 26 and 27. However, we have found that the 70 weeks are literal weeks and that the length of Jesus Christ's ministry was actually 70 weeks in length. It ran from February of 27 AD until the Pentecost of 28 AD, and that is 70 weeks. And that fits with everything, all the other dates that are available. For example, we know when Jesus was born in 3 BC on Rosh Hashanah, and that he was almost 30 when he was baptized, so he was 29. And then, of course, the 14th of Nisan on a Wednesday. So all of the things that we know to be true fit with this 70 weeks being 70 literal weeks. So this prophecy that they try to use to predict the end times is trying to prove something that is incorrect. But in here there is a abomination of desolation. And it says that unto the end of the war, desolations are determined. Well, what war? Well, the war between good and evil. That war was between light and darkness. There was the war between God and the devil. When was the city and its sanctuary destroyed? And when did the end thereof happen with a flood? Well, another meaning for the word flood is a military charge. And who were the people of the prince that shall come? Who was that prince? Well, actually, this occurred in 70 AD when Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed by the Romans. The 4 Roman legions were the people of the prince, and the prince was Titus, who was the future emperor. It involved a third fulfillment of this prophecy about the abomination of desolation. The Romans did desecrate the Holy of Holies on the day the temple was destroyed, when the legionnaires sacrificed to their standards in the Holy of Holies. So the abomination of desolation prophecy actually occurred 3 times. And I'll give more information about that in my notes because we don't have time to cover the whole thing. Now, there seems to be some patterns afoot here. It's very interesting because the first temple and the second temple were destroyed on the exact same day of the month. The 9th day of the month of Av is the saddest day in the Jewish calendar because Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple on that day and Titus destroyed the second temple in 70 AD on that same day. Now, what are the odds of that? I mean, it's got to be symbolic of something. Now, is that the only day like that? No. Also, the children of Israel were freed from Egypt on the exact same day that Abraham prophesied it 400 years earlier. Another synchronism is on the exact same day that the ark came to rest on Mount Ararat. It was on the 17th of the month. That is the exact same day of the month that Jesus was raised from among the dead. So there's got to be bigger patterns afoot here that we haven't gotten our arms around yet. So I am sure that there's a lot of symbolism here that maybe someday we'll understand more about. But the abomination of desolation having to do with the temple, I believe, or will occur 3 times. The first time was the 2300 days that Daniel spoke of, and that happened back with Antiochus sacrificing the pig on the altar. The second time that it occurred was when the temple was destroyed by Titus, and there was a desecration of the altar then when the Roman legions sacrificed to their standards in the temple. I don't have time to read it, but there's a very vivid account of the destruction of the temple by Josephus. And the detail in this is just heart-rending. And then there will be a third desecration of the third temple in the future, and that's when the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is in worship, so that he as God sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. That will be an abomination of desolation as well. So this is what Jesus prophesied about. Now, there are a group of people out there that say that Jesus already came back in 70 AD. They're called preterists. And I think they're nuts, but they say they have proof that Jesus came back in 70 AD. Now, I just cannot believe that, because I speak in tongues. And we know that which is in part shall be done away, right? So if Jesus already came back, I would not be able to speak in tongues. But what they do is they take one verse. They're another one verse Charlie group, and I'll show you what that is in a moment. But they take one verse and they say, well, this is why Jesus came back in 70 AD. And so they take the Olivet Discourse and they try to fit it with what their doctrine is. Well, Jesus said that if you're on the rooftop, don't take time to get into your house, just leave. He said that if you're in the field, don't go back to your house to get your clothes, just leave. And then he said, you're supposed to flee to the mountains. Well, what happened actually during that time was Jerusalem was surrounded by 4 legions of Roman armies, and they happened to get there right during Passover. So many, many Jews were in Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, and then they were trapped there by 4 legions, and they were not allowed to leave. All right? And this is before the abomination of desolation occurred, when the temple was destroyed. Jerusalem was besieged for many months. Now, during that time, anyone who tried to flee was killed or captured. Jesus said, if you're out in Judea and you see the abomination of desolation, you're supposed to flee to the mountains. Well, with all of the soldiers out there, that would have been extremely difficult. Now, some people say, well, the Christians escaped. Eusebius says the Christians escaped and they went to Pella. Pella is a city in modern-day Jordan. But when the Christians fled to Pella, Pella is not in the mountains. Pella is in the Jordan Valley. So the Christians fleeing to Pella were not a fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy saying, go to the mountains. Then also, Jesus said there will be a great tribulation like the world has never known. Well, that did not occur with the abomination of desolation that occurred in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. So I don't think that this is a fulfillment of the prophecy that the preterists want us to believe. That's a little bit on the abomination of desolation. Now, in the last few minutes that we have here, we're going to complete the Olivet Discourse. So go to Matthew 24, verse 23. Matthew chapter 24, verse 23. Then if any man shall say to you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you before. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, Behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not. Verse 27, For as the lightning comes out of the east and shines even unto the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. In other words, everybody's going to see it. Verse 28, For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles, the vultures, be gathered together. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be broken. Now, this astronomical phenomena with the stars and all of that fits with Revelation chapter 6, verse 12 through 17. Revelation chapter 6, verse 12, And behold, he opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. Verse 13, And the stars of heaven fell unto the earth. So that synchronizes the sixth seal with what Jesus was saying in the Olivet Discourse. The same astronomical phenomena will occur. So then, the next one is, now this is interesting. I want to show you how the layers actually cover the same events. Revelation chapter 7, go there. Revelation chapter 7. Verse 1 through 3. After these things I saw four angels standing on the four corners of the earth, holding the four winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on any tree. And I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. He cried with a loud voice to the four angels, to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, Hurt not the earth, neither the sea nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads. And now it's going to talk about the 144,000. They're mentioned for the first time. Revelation 7:4, I heard the number of them who were sealed as 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel. So the 144,000 are mentioned in Revelation chapter 7. This is the second layer. But then, in the third layer, in Revelation 14:1, they are here. Revelation 14:1. So I looked, and lo, this is a new vision. A lamb stood on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his father's name written in their foreheads. So layer 2 talks about the 144,000 in chapter 7, and then layer 3 is retelling the events, and it gets to the 144,000 in Revelation 14. See. Then you get to Revelation chapter 7, verse 9. It says, After this I beheld, and lo, a great multitude which no man could number, of all nations and kindreds and peoples and tongues, stood before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes and palms in their hands. Now who are these? If they're standing before the Lamb, clothed with white robes, this is the resurrection of the just. Okay? Kindreds and nations and peoples and tongues, right? But this is only Revelation chapter 7. Well, if Revelation were chronological, this would be out of order. But see, this is in the second layer. So the second layer goes all the way from the gathering together when the Antichrist shows up with all of the seals all the way through to the end of the book of Revelation in just that layer. See, verse 10, And they cried with a loud voice, saying, Salvation to our God, who sits upon the throne and unto the Lamb. And all the angels stood round about the throne and about the elders. Well, there's the 24 elders right there, and the four beasts, and fell before the throne on their faces and worshiped God, saying, Amen, and blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might be unto our God forever and ever. Amen. One of the elders answered and said to me, Who are these who are arrayed in white robes? And John said to him, verse 14, well, you know, that's a good answer. And he said to me, these are they who came out of the great tribulation and have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Well, if they came out of the great tribulation, they can't be in the grace administration. They have to be in the sixth administration. And if they're the white robes of the ones that were under the altar. And verse 15, therefore are they before the throne of God and serve him day and night in the temple, and he that sits on the throne shall dwell among them, and they shall hunger no more, neither thirst any more, neither shall the sun light on them, nor any heat. Well, wait a minute, that's talked about in Revelation chapter 20, right? Verse 17, for the Lamb which is in the midst of the throne shall feed them, and shall lead them unto living fountains of waters, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. That's Revelation 21. But see, this is still chapter 7. So you see how each layer chronologically starts with the gathering together and goes all the way to the end. But it is talking about the events in light of its theme, which in the second layer is the legal causes that were behind the judgment of the earth. Now, we'll get to the last seal here. Revelation chapter 8, verse 1 through 4. When he had opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven about the space of half an hour. That's really significant because all the other voices sounded, well, there's now no voice. That's just really amazing. It was such a profound moment because now the seventh seal is here and the end is near. And verse 2, and I saw the seven angels which stood before God, and them were given seven trumpets. Another angel came and stood at the altar having a golden censer, and there was given to him much incense that he should offer it with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. And the smoke of the incense which came with the prayers of the saints ascended up before God out of the angel's hand. Well, what were the saints praying for? I think they were praying for justice, just like you and I do. Well, now, those prayers are all going to be answered. Hallelujah. And so the angel took the censer, verse 5, and filled it with the fire of the altar and cast it to the earth. And there were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. There's that phrase again. So this is the beginning of another layer. See, this is the beginning of the third layer with that repetition of voices and thunderings and lightnings. So then Jesus in the Olivet Discourse, he finishes up in verse 30. He says, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And Matthew 24:31, and he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds and from one end of heaven to the other. Now, is this the gathering together? No. All the other things we've seen are sixth administration. See, the 24 elders and the people underneath the throne, and then the indications that Jesus talked about in the Olivet Discourse about don't flee on the Sabbath, and then be saved if they stand until the end, and all the other things that we're seeing fit. So this is like the gathering together, but it is not the gathering together. Okay? It is the first resurrection. See, when he gathers those. Now, that's what I just read to you was from the beginning of level 3. Then later on in Revelation 14, which is also part of level 3, it says, Revelation 14 verse 14, and I looked, and behold a white cloud, and upon the cloud one sat like unto the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, thrust in thy sickle and reap, for the time is come for thee to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. And he that sat on the cloud thrust in his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. So that is talking about the resurrection of the just. But it's similar to the gathering together, you see. Daniel had a prophecy. Daniel chapter 7, verse 13 and 14. He says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came in the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days. And they brought him near before him, and there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. See? So it's a similar situation, but this is just before the resurrection of the just, the battle of Armageddon, and the millennial kingdom. So, that's what Jesus is talking about. He's not talking about the gathering together. Then, to finish up, Matthew 24, verse 37. But as in the days of Noah, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered unto the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Then shall two be in the field, one shall be taken and the other left. Two women shall be grinding at the mill, and one shall be taken and the other left. Is that the gathering together? No, it is preceding the resurrection of the just in the sixth administration. So finally, I just have to handle one more thing, and that is in Matthew 24, verse 32 through 36. Jesus said, Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. So likewise, when you see all these things and know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say to you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. But of that day and that hour knows no man, no, not the angels in heaven, but my Father only. Now, this is a difficult verse that Jesus said, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. That is the verse that the preterists use to say that Jesus came back in 70 AD. Jesus prophesied this in 28 AD. So the generation shall not pass. There will still be people living from that generation, which there were in 70 AD, they say. And so they say, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. So they say, well, that's what Jesus said, so he must have come back in 70 AD because that's what he said. But I think that the truth is very easy to discern if you know the clues. And I've taught you some clues. So I'm going to read verse 33 and 34, and let's see if you can see the clues. Okay? So, he said, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Okay? What things? Matthew 24, verse 33. So likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Do you see the clue? It's right there staring us in the face. It's a repetition. Jesus protected the truth with another repetition. All these things. See, the preterists only point to one thing, which is the destruction of the temple. But that one thing they point to wasn't actually even in the Olivet Discourse. Jesus talked about the temple when he was leaving the temple hours earlier. Then they had to cross the valley like we talked about and go up the hill like we talked about last week. And then the committee of the apostles met with him. But it says when he sat. So that probably was later on after they had the meal, and so then they had a night owl or whatever you want to call it, where Jesus sat and then his apostles could come and ask him questions. So the Olivet Discourse was probably several hours after what Jesus said about the destruction of the temple. So all these things, what things? All the things in the Olivet Discourse. So when you see all these things, what things? The abomination of desolation, the wars and rumors of wars. Well, there were not wars, plural, and rumors of wars in 70 AD. There was only one war, the Jewish revolt. So there's a lot of things that don't fit what the preterists say, but they'll insist that it does, but it doesn't fit. The most difficult thing was this one verse, this generation shall not pass until all these things be fulfilled. What generation? The generation in the 6th administration when all of this occurs. Okay? And Jesus even told us that, Matthew 24 verse 22, except those days be shortened, there should be no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake those days shall be shortened. So, many eschatologists say that the era of the Antichrist and all of that leading up to the millennial kingdom is going to be 7 years. And we even have that because it talked about the Antichrist having 42 months. And then there's another prophecy about the 2 prophets that are going to prophesy. And they have 1,260 days. Well, you add that all up. The people have said, well, it's near 7 years. And that is, these days should be shortened. That is within one generation. This generation shall not pass until these things come to pass. So, there you have the Olivet Discourse. And then what does Jesus end up with? He says, to watch. Okay? Like the goodman of the house, had he known what hour the thief would have come, he would have watched. See? So, we need to watch. And those people in that administration need to watch. But I'll end up with 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 verse 1. It says, but of the times and of the seasons, brethren, you have no need that I write unto you. Why? Verse 2, for yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. So he had already told them, look, you guys are not going to know when the day of the Lord is coming. For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, that day should overtake you as a thief. Why? The day of the Lord, the 6th administration day, we're going to depart first. It says, verse 5, you are children of the light and the children of the day. We are not of the night or darkness. So we as children of the light and children of the day are going to be taken out of the way. See? And you get down to verse 9, for God has not appointed us to wrath, but to obtain salvation by our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, that whether we wake or sleep, we should live together with him. Wherefore comfort yourselves together and edify one another, as also you do. So, we know, because of the mystery, because of our understanding of dispensations, because of our understanding of the dead alive now, and if they are or not, we know and can put together a picture of the book of Revelation that is accurate and that fits. So, in the future, I'm going to be writing this further in my book that ultimately I plan on doing on the one hope of original Christianity, that I will piece together as much as I can. But as I said, I don't expect to be able to piece everything together, because some of it we won't know, and those who are left behind will have prophets to tell them what they need to do. So, for us now as Christians, the best thing we can do is concentrate on our own administration, on our ministries, and upon walking as He walked, and earn our rewards, because those are what's going to affect us for eternity. And on that great day that Jesus comes back, then we're going to be changed, or we're going to arise. We're going to have new bodies, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. We don't have to worry about being deceived by the Antichrist, because we are not going to be there. We're going to be taken out of the way, and then the Antichrist shall be revealed. So what a comfort. And I trust that this information will help people not be afraid and not be worried about events that some people say are happening because we are living in the book of Revelation. We are not living in that period, because the gathering together has to come first. So, God bless, and thanks for listening.